The war has led NATO to reevaluate security, especially on its eastern flank with Russia. Germany's recent announcement of a permanent troop deployment there, the first of its kind since the Second World War, is just one such change. Here's DW's Terry Schultz.
Russia's war on Ukraine made NATO take another look at Moscow and in the mirror, resulting in the biggest reconfiguration of the alliance since the Soviet Union crumbled more than 30 years ago. The new plans were approved at NATO's Vilnius summit in July.
We took major decisions to adapt our alliance for the future. We agreed NATO's most detailed and robust defense plan since the Cold War.
Defense plans that look like those from the Cold War, dividing alliance territory into regional commands, outlining extraordinary operational detail in thousands of highly classified pages.
It's kind of how many ships do you need here, how many soldiers do you need there. Then, of course, you take it down below that, and then you get into the real nitty-gritty of how you would move the ships around, how you would move the soldiers around, how you would resupply in great detail, all the sorts of things that you would expect to have in place were they ever needed.
Were they ever needed, the plans envisioned 300,000 troops could move to NATO's border with Russia within 30 days. One big change may seem painfully obvious, but wasn't automatic: identifying Russia by name as the alliance's main adversary.
Any opportunity to not consider Russia as an enemy has been lost by what we've seen in Ukraine, and the very fact that we've written it quite clearly, and it's being used in our documentation.
This political shift is huge for the alliance, finally allowing open strategizing about how to beat its most likely opponent, says military analyst Alexander Matelar.
There is a much higher degree of detail that is available for military planners to work with in terms of exercising, in terms of planning, and thinking through the campaign design.
Despite the political differences among allied governments that come out in other places, here at NATO's military headquarters in Mons, Belgium, Admiral Blount says everyone's on the same page. But will that change now that they've got 4,000 new pages of plans to implement? Each ally will be required to provide specific capabilities, equipment, troops, and to keep them at a high degree of readiness. This will be expensive, and some governments aren't yet even close to spending the 2% of GDP on defense that's now a minimum expectation. Still, Admiral Blount insists the unanimous approval of the plans demonstrates unwavering unity within NATO.
We haven't seen anything but that since Ukraine has been illegally invaded by Russia.
Professor Matelar says it's important that the agreement has been formalized in writing.
On paper, you have that consensus there that NATO machinery can build upon.
Even if, in practice, he notes, there's still a handful of allies less than fully committed to their new responsibilities, Matelar says Russia's actions are a constant reminder of the risks of not doing so.
Thanks for that report, Terry. Let's delve a little deeper. Just how forward-thinking are NATO's new military plans?
This is the biggest reconfiguration that NATO has undertaken since the end of the Cold War. And the ironic thing about this forward look is that parts of it look very much like Cold War thinking, in that NATO is again considering that it may have to fight a war with Russia. That's something that fell by the wayside in decades past when Russia seemed to be a more peaceful neighbor to NATO allies, but no longer. So I think some of our viewers may be surprised that NATO never mentioned Russia as the potential opponent. There was always an imaginary country that it was staging these exercises against, but now they will start to say Russia. And they've got, all the examples they need for how Russia fights a war right there alongside NATO allies in Ukraine. And that's going to change the way that NATO deploys its resources. You've now got troops pre-positioned along the Russian border. You've got more equipment there. And you've got what NATO calls regionalization. You've got responsibility for these areas delegated to countries in the region so that you're not looking at making plans only from Brussels. You've got responsibility right there on the front line.
So, Terry, how prepared is NATO in comparison to just a couple of years ago?
Well, just a couple years ago was 2022, and I think everything's changed since then. You know, NATO started to take a closer look at Russia's challenges after its first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, but it was really this all-out assault on Ukraine that focused minds. Now, think about it. NATO countries have basically emptied their stockpiles to send old equipment to Ukraine. That means they're ordering new equipment, and that means they'll have upgraded capabilities should it become necessary to use it against an opponent. So in that sense, they've really upgraded their stockpiles and their arsenals. At the same time, they've upgraded their thinking, and I think that's probably been the most important shift. Everyone, has to understand that they don't know what the Kremlin's going to do, and possibly deterrence won't work anymore, and you may again have to consider fighting a land war with Russia.
But Terry, talking about thinking, we keep hearing about Ukraine fatigue. How could that change things?
Oh, that could change things a lot because, as any of the Baltic states and the other frontline NATO allies will tell you, they are very much aware that if Russia is allowed to win in Ukraine, it's not going to stop there. It's going to be emboldened, and they very much fear that they will be next. So this is why everyone here at NATO is also watching what happens in Washington with a lot of concern. The fact that the Biden administration is warning that if Congress doesn't pass this next tranche of aid to Ukraine, there's $61 billion or something like that waiting for congressional approval, that they're very worried. And Ukraine knows, and NATO allies know, that without support from the United States, it will be very difficult for Europe to fill that gap. European governments are going to have to be very much looking at how they can dig deeper, too, to possibly fill these gaps in helping Ukraine.
DW's Terry Schultz.